Right, so let's get ourselves underway. Just by way of introduction, first of all, I already mentioned my name's John Hope. I have the pleasure of being Senior Technology Evangelist at Sophos. I've been at Sophos since 2011. I've enjoyed lots of different jobs at Sophos during my time. However, I'm not going to bore you with my entire career history because that's what LinkedIn's for. And if you want to stalk/follow me on LinkedIn, you are very welcome to do so. I'd like to think I post occasional useful bits of information on there. I can help you out with sailing a dinghy or taking photographs or how to perform CPR on a dog as activities that constitute hobbies in my life. But it's not really about me, of course. What I really wanted to focus on is the content for today's webinar. So you've joined today because you're interested in the need for human threat hunting, and once again, welcome. However, if we're going to explore why there is a need for human threat hunting, it's really important to understand the background and essentially what the cybersecurity landscape looks like today. So I'm going to spend the first part of this session really just looking at the cyber landscape and understanding exactly what is driving this need for human threat hunting. And I'm going to do that by drawing on two sets of source data, which I think you will find very useful. And both of these assets are available on the Sophos website. They're available for download free of charge, and they're both really interesting reads. So the first set of source data comes from the state of ransomware, and we produce this report every 12 months. It is essentially a vendor agnostic survey. So we contact 3,000 IT administrators, decision makers, budget holders worldwide, and we ask them for their experiences of cybersecurity. So the data that's in there is very much dependent on their responses, and it's worth emphasizing that within that survey, those respondents are selected at random, so they aren't necessarily, and probably statistically speaking, aren't Sophos customers, but nevertheless, that is a great report that gives us a good feel for the threat landscape, particularly, as the name would suggest, focusing on ransomware. The other report that I'm going to pull some data from during the course of today's session is our report of the Active Adversary Report, which is produced once every 3 months by my colleague John Shire from the Office of the Field CTO. And this is an interesting report because the data behind this report is actually drawn from our own engagements with customers. So these might be existing Sophos customers, and we can get a lot of interesting telemetry from an existing Sophos estate. They may also be Sophos MDR customers, which means they may or may not be using Sophos Tech, but they're certainly using our security as a service offerings. We get lots of interesting data from there. Or they could be incident response customers, and this is where they may well have never had any Sophos service or technology before, but they're calling us up because they've had some kind of cyber incident and they need our help to resolve those issues. So just bear in mind when we look at those two sets of data, one is a survey, one is very much hands-on empirical evidence of situations that we've been involved in one way, shape or form. So we'll start out with the state of ransomware report, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on really the sorry state of cybersecurity. First and foremost, the highlight from that report is that of those 3,000 respondents, 66% of those organizations experienced at least one ransomware outbreak in the 12 months running up to the survey, which, whilst it sounds like a troubling statistic, is actually exactly the same level as it was last year. So this tells us that ransomware is and continues to be a major challenge for organizations all across the world. What is also interesting is that 76% of those attacks actually involved the successful encryption of data. And that has actually gone up quite dramatically from 65% in the previous 12 months. And this tells us quite a lot about the cyber criminals' skills. So one of the things that we've observed is as cyber criminals sort of coalesce into gangs and organizations, their skill set has increased. All human beings all learn collectively better. And as a result of being able to share ideas, code in some cases, either inside gangs or even sometimes between different cybercrime organizations, their ability to encrypt data has actually improved. So they're effectively getting better at their trade. The statistic, however, that bothers me the most from the state of ransomware report is the fact that 46% of those organizations that experienced some form of encryption elected to pay the cyber criminals off. So they felt that their best or their only option was to pay the cyber criminals off in the hope that they got their data back. And while that is troubling, it's actually, again, exactly the same statistic as it was last year. So it tells us that a lot of organizations are maybe not as prepared as they could be for some kind of cyber incident, because obviously you don't want to be in a position where you're placing your hopes and the future of your business on the honesty of a cyber criminal, and placing faith in their ability to return that data to you. And then last but not least, the average cost of ransomware is now an eye-watering $1.82 million. When you encompass things like loss to business opportunity, lost revenue, regulatory fines, damage to reputation, so on and so forth, there's a lot of things that go into that number. It is, needless to say, an expensive and painful experience to be hit by ransomware, and that figure has gone up from 1.4 million last year. I don't know quite what sorts of organizations you're working for. If that number looks crazy, unrealistic, expensive to you, suffice to say, another way of phrasing this is ransomware consistently does put organizations out of business. That is the unfortunate reality. So just a little word on who are behind these attacks. And I've already alluded to this to an extent, but the media would have you believe that this is what a cyber criminal looks like. We often show graphics of teenagers wearing hoodies, maybe hanging out in mum's basement, operating in isolation. But the reality of cybercrime these days is that these organizations are highly, highly organized that launch ransomware, and practically all ransomware worldwide is delivered by one of these major cybercrime gangs. And we know a lot about the structure of cybercrime gangs, particularly because of this individual organization, which is Conti. And Conti is a name that maybe you've heard in the past, probably in the news and on TV or something like that, because Conti, if we wind the clock back to 2021, Conti were the A-game players in ransomware. They were responsible for about a quarter of ransomware worldwide. So they were a huge organization and very successful at what they were doing. However, you'll see that in the period of 2022, their fall from grace was quite dramatic, and during that time period, they were only responsible for less than 5% of ransomware worldwide. And the reason behind that is because they had a very, very public disagreement. So at the start of the Ukrainian conflict, Conti, being a Russian organization, came out very publicly to say essentially that they would support Russia's activity using cyber means. And the interesting thing about that statement is around about half the affiliates inside Conti at the time were actually Ukrainians. So there was an obvious disagreement there. Those Ukrainians were not quite as on board with that particular message. And Conti fell apart very publicly. And the reason that I'm telling you this is, as a result of that falling out, a lot of data fell out of that organization. We learned a huge amount about how a cyber gang operates. We understand now that they really have a business model that looks almost like a legitimate organization and legitimate business in every way. So we're talking about things like line managers, HR departments, monthly salaries, monthly targets, career progression, essentially every kind of department that you would find in a legitimate business, except for the way they're actually going about making their money. So these people are really, really highly organized individuals, and they have a huge wealth of both human and financial and technology resources behind them to be able to be successful in the world of ransomware and to be able to launch such a wide, diverse set of sophisticated attacks. And this is really important because it has influenced the way that ransomware operates and the way that ransomware is delivered. So it's really, really important to understand, first of all, that the reality of modern cybercrime is that a very large percentage of the more sophisticated ransomware attacks are actually delivered by a human operative. And that might be slightly counterintuitive. Of course, we live in a world where we're seeing so much more automation. If you look at your own lives and look at the influence of artificial intelligence in particular, we're seeing humans stepping back from so many processes in day-to-day life. But actually, the cybercrime gangs are going in the opposite direction, and they're increasingly utilizing skilled human resources to launch their attacks. And the reason that they do that is because humans are blessed with this capability that maybe artificial intelligence doesn't quite yet have, this ability to come at a problem from different angles. If they don't see success for the first time, then pivoting with their tactics, trying new approaches, constantly changing and evolving the way they do things in order to overcome cybersecurity defense measures. So it's really important to understand that as I say, the more sophisticated attacks out there, there's actually a human being at the opposite end of the line in many cases. And the obvious question next is, as an organization, as a cybersecurity vendor, what are Sophos doing about this new challenge, and what are we doing with our products and our services in order to defend organizations from these human-driven attacks? And one of the first bits of innovation that I really wanted to highlight to you really does start to address one of the typical challenges we see now with human-delivered ransomware, and that is the concept of remote encryption. I'm going to show you what remote encryption looks like in a little bit more detail in a second. But this has become a technique of choice because many cybersecurity vendors don't effectively protect against this approach of remote encryption. So the way it looks is this, is that the cyber criminals will often find either a device that has no protection on it, because maybe the administrator has forgotten to install some antivirus solution on there, or maybe that protection is out of date, or it's not adequate for the task, or maybe it's just a device that's either a guest or a device that just simply cannot have endpoint protection installed on there. You know, maybe it's a machine tool in a factory or whatever. But essentially, the first play in the anatomy of a remote ransomware attack is that the cyber criminals will find a device which is vulnerable, and they will use that as a bridgehead. What they will do next is then scout around the network and look for other devices inside the estate that have the interesting data that they would like to encrypt. So rather than necessarily launching the attack and encrypting the data on the device they've actually got hold of, they are instead looking for victims around the rest of the estate that they can encrypt data on. And sometimes, even if those devices have some form of endpoint protection on them, as I've already mentioned, many of the vendors out there, they don't actually offer a protection that includes protection of data that is being encrypted using some kind of remote command, because that's exactly what they want to do next. So once they've identified these machines that have that data on there, they will then launch processes to remotely encrypt the data on those devices. And from there on in, this is then the standard ransomware attack. So the data has been encrypted. The unfortunate victim gets an alert and a notification that the data has been encrypted, and they are then presented with that stark choice of, do I pay the cyber criminals and hope that I get my data back, or do I simply accept that that data has been lost? So the cyber criminals are essentially using the human operative to be able to look around the estate, find other machines, encrypt the data remotely, knowing that in many cases it will bypass the protection. However, if you happen to be a Sophos customer, I have some good news for you. So InterceptX has the ability to protect endpoints from both local encryption and also remote driven encryption. So let's for the interest of fairness, let's explain exactly the same scenario all over again when you happen to be a Sophos customer. So again, there may be devices inside your estate that are simply unmanaged or unprotected or compromised in some way, and the cyber criminals may still be able to get onto that device in the first instance. But if they identify other machines in the estate that have that data on there, when they attempt to launch those remote encryption processes, InterceptX will actually detect the fact that the remote encryption command has come in, and the standard CryptoGuard functionality that many of you will be familiar with will still kick in. So it will recognize that an encryption command has been sent, and it will both block and deny that encryption attempt, but then also roll any affected data back into its original state, thereby protecting the data and returning it to original state. But then there's another step along the process as well, which is that CryptoGuard will then block the IP address of the compromised device or the compromised devices to make sure that any further attempts to move laterally and any further attempts to encrypt data using those compromised devices will actually be rejected. And of course, the next step is that this will flag up inside Software Central to say, first and foremost, that the device has been under attack, but also the source of the attack so that we can identify that. And the administrator can then go about doing the things they need to do in order to remediate. So that just shows you a little bit of a response there on some of the things that Sophos are doing to help with that issue of remote encryption, which is incredibly popular. But of course, not all attacks involve encryption, and there are lots of other processes and approaches that the cyber criminals will use. And one of the things that we've learned a lot about as a result of operating cybersecurity as a service is that The cyber criminals are incredibly determined. Of course, I already mentioned there's a huge wealth of resources available to the cyber criminals, and if they decide they're going to attack an organization, they will often continue to throw resources at a scenario until they get resolution. And that's why we developed a feature within Intercept X called Adaptive Attack Protection. And what this is doing is essentially recognizing the telltale signs that the cyber criminals are constantly trying to attack a device. Because essentially one of the things that we realized is that if you give a cyber criminal long enough and free reign in an estate, eventually they will find a way. It's a little bit like if you left me outside your house with a lock picking kit and access to YouTube, eventually I'd probably figure out how to get in. It's just essentially a matter of time. And we want to take the luxury of time away from these attacks. So if we see the telltale signs that the cyber criminals are picking on a device and attacking that device, the device will go into a protection mode. So if we see the attacker constantly pivoting to try new steps and carrying out traditional processes that we would associate with an ongoing cyber attack, Intercept X will automatically kick in and block those activities and block the resources associated with them. So, for example, revoking things like remote desktop tools so that the cyber criminals can't utilize those to move laterally and move around the estate. And we will stay in that mode until the cyber criminals move on to another victim. So this is a very powerful way of mitigating the fact that if you're up against an active adversary who is very determined, they will eventually find a way. This is reducing that luxury of time, taking the tools that the cyber criminals need in order to move around the estate, and then really just making it too difficult, tar pitting the attack effectively to the point where the cyber criminals will move on to another victim. So another nice little add-on. I should add, by the way, that both of these features are standard within Intercept X, and if you've been a customer for a long time, these are features that are enabled by default once they've been rolled out. We also have added in a critical attack warning within Sophos Central. So if we recognize under certain circumstances that the organization is under some kind of large-scale attack, we will notify the organization using a couple of different methodologies. So we will put banners inside Sophos Central, we will email, and we will send out notifications via mobile as well. So just a little bit of a call to action. If you are a Sophos customer already, then please just make sure all your contact details and settings are up to date to make sure if you are the unfortunate victim of a critical attack of this nature, that you're getting those notifications as quickly as possible and the right people are being notified so that you can respond accordingly. We've also got the account health check as well, which again, if you've not logged into Sophos Central for a little while, this is a relatively new feature that we've incorporated, which actually looks at your policies within Sophos Central and highlights where maybe you've created some rules or exceptions that are contrary to best policy. So it will assess your security posture and highlight where maybe you're not following best practices and then give you the opportunity to review those. This is by no means a substitute for having a Sophos engineer take a look at your health status, but it's a good check to see how your policy is looking and to make sure that it's appropriate for your needs. And again, bear in mind, if we look back to how the cyber criminals operate, any kind of vulnerability they get hold of, they will utilize. So it is a really unfortunate scenario if you happen to have protection on there, but the cyber criminals are still making use of that device because the policies are not best practice. So really good opportunity. Again, another call to action, log into Sophos Central if you're a Sophos customer. Just check your health status and just make sure the policies are still appropriate and the exceptions are in there for a good reason and they're appropriate for the business needs. So a little bit of an extra free tool in there as well. However, I'm going to temper all of that by saying that whilst there's some really, really good and absolutely groundbreaking technology inside the Sophos portfolio, the reality is, unfortunately, that technology isn't always going to be enough to combat these latest generation of threats. I've already mentioned that humans are blessed with this ability to look at a problem in different ways, evolve, change tactics. And the only real way to keep on top of these new attack techniques is really combating human expertise with more human expertise. So humans have the ability to contextualize and recognize the telltale signs that something just isn't quite right and then carry out further investigations. And this is particularly relevant when we look at the way that active adversaries operate today. So many attacks are now multi-stage attacks. So the remote encryption is a really good example of a multi-stage attack, because the end effect of that attack, i.e. the data being encrypted, is not the starting point of the attack. The cyber criminals will have already found a way into this state. They may have moved laterally several times. They may have done things like privilege escalation before eventually the product of their labor drops out the other side. So it becomes really difficult using technology on its own to be able to join the dots and understand how that attack took place. You've also got the challenge as well that the cyber criminals are increasingly using a technique called living off the land. This is where they are blending their attacks and using legitimate IT tools against a victim organization. So we'll look at what some of those tools are in just a short while, but you can appreciate that actually the challenge here is how do we deal with that problem when we need to use these tools for legitimate business purposes, but then all of a sudden the cyber criminals in many cases are using these tools against us. Then you've got the fact that cyber criminals often exploit weaknesses. They exploit weaknesses in terms of unprotected devices. We've just talked about that, but they also time their attacks appropriately to target organizations when their ability to respond is at their minimum. And then last but not least, you've got this concept of credential abuse. So using legitimate admin logins, using legitimate user logins against the organization. And again, you can appreciate how that's really hard for technology to understand, because a user is logged in, appears to be legitimate, but then all of a sudden they're carrying out malicious activities. It can be very hard for technology on its own to contextualize. A human operative can look at that very easily and say, well, this particular user shouldn't be doing that activity. This is out of character. So we're going to focus on the compromised credentials first of all, because that's actually one of the biggest challenges now with cybersecurity, is how do you tell the difference between a legitimate user logging in to do legitimate things versus the cyber criminals using those identities against us. And you can see very easily, if you compare stats from 2022 through to the latest set of statistics, you will see that actually the technology approach of exploiting vulnerabilities has actually dropped away in terms of popularity. And instead what we're seeing is a dramatic rise of the use of compromised credentials, because the cyber criminals know that if they can't brute force into an account, maybe they can just persuade a user to give them their username and password using techniques like social engineering, for example. And then once they've got those credentials, it becomes a lot easier once you're in an organization to start moving around the estate. We also talked about the fact that cyber criminals target organizations at their weakest. Now, bearing in mind, of course, that there is a wealth of resources available within the cyber criminal gang, they will work out what your organization's momentum looks like, and they will work out what your ability to respond looks like as well. So you'll see that there is an increasing trend and very dramatic movement towards attacking organizations during times when they do not have the ability to respond. So when we define the business working day as 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. during weekdays, you'll see that now 91% of the attacks that we observed in the active adversary report, those were observed out of hours. So the cyber criminals intentionally target those times because they know that maybe the IT administrator is not there, nobody's monitoring the dashboards, nobody's looking at the estate, and it gives them plenty of time to move around the estate, carry out their nefarious deeds. And often the first thing that an organization realizes they're under attack is when they come back to work, let's say on Monday morning, and all of a sudden their network's in flames and all of their data has been encrypted. So the cyber criminals are very, very good at understanding what your weak spots are. And then, of course, I mentioned about living off the land. So these are some of the tools that we observed inside the active adversary report, ranked by their popularity. And you'll see that these are regular day-to-day IT tools. So these lol bins or living off the lol binaries, these are popular tools that the cyber criminals will use against organizations. So it's really interesting to see what those modes of attack actually look like. And one of those in particular I wanted to highlight was RDP, because we still see a large number of attacks, in fact, an increasing number of attacks utilizing RDP, either to get in from the outside world or increasingly to move around internally once you're into the estate. So once you've penetrated the potentially the harder shell of the outside of the network, it's actually generally acceptable use policy to use tools like RDP internally to move, and obviously the cyber criminals will use that to move around the estate. So we're increasingly seeing that. We're also seeing as well protection being disabled. So again, this is gaining popularity as protection measures get better. In the one hand, if we can shut those protection measures down or find ways around them, such as unprotected devices, that is increasingly popular. And obviously we've seen that technique of remote encryption, where actually using a non-protected device is a really good bridgehead for the cyber criminals to then move around the rest of the estate. And one of the ultimate goals is typically Active Directory. So obviously once you've got hold of Active Directory with appropriate accounts, you've effectively got the keys to the kingdom here at this point. And now we're seeing that attack time dramatically reducing, and the ability to get hold of Active Directory is now typically median time is typically 16 hours into an attack. The cyber criminals are now owning your directory structure. And on the subject of pace of attacks, actually one of the biggest takeaways from the latest Active Adversary report is the fact that the average dwell time is now dramatically reducing. Just to give you some context and provide you with a precise definition of exactly what dwell time is in this context. The dwell time is considered to be the time from when the organization is initially penetrated by an attack through to the time where the cyber criminals will carry out their action on objective, which is typically to encrypt data or to steal data by some way, shape or form. And you can see here that actually, particularly with ransomware, the dwell time is reduced dramatically, and now there is a almost 50% set of ransomware attacks that will typically take 5 days or less. So all of a sudden, the ability to recognize the telltale signs you're about to be attacked and you have a problem, that ability to respond is really reducing. So it used to be something in the order of 16 days, and now it's more like 5 days. So it's reducing that window to spot that your organization is actually under attack. The opposite side of the fence and the outlier here, you may notice down the bottom here, is the coin miner. Because obviously the dwell time you want, if you're going to use a coin miner to churn out cryptocurrency on somebody else's devices, you want that to dwell there for as long as you possibly can, because all the time it's sitting there undetected, it is generating small but nevertheless meaningful returns for the cyber criminal. So that's the kind of one exception that you see there, is that the coin miners are very, very good at sort of staying under the radar and staying present for a very long period of time without being detected. And one of the other things that we see a lot with the cyber criminals as well, it's worth mentioning, is that they're very good now at removing evidence, which then becomes really problematic when an organization is obliged to file reports with regulatory bodies, or if you even just wanted to understand how an attack took place, why it took place, and what the steps behind that attack were, so that you can learn from it for the future, it's incredibly difficult when you don't have that data. And we're seeing an increasingly large number of attacks where either telemetry is missing because the underlying protection itself has been disabled and therefore is not collating telemetry, or we're seeing attacks where the cyber criminals have intentionally deleted the log data, thereby covering their tracks and rendering any investigation quite challenging. And then we do still, unfortunately, see a large number of incidents where the defenders and the organisation maybe they're not set up logging correctly in the first place. So whether the cyber criminals made any attempt to delete that data or not is probably meaningless, because the data itself that has been collated is not up to standard, or maybe just not being collated at all. So there's no evidence to look back on in the first place. But of course, that does cause really significant challenges when it comes to investigating an incident post-attack. So I've given you a pretty good overview there, hopefully, of the cyber criminal motives, the techniques, the way that things have shifted, and I've highlighted some of the places where technology can help, and I've also highlighted some of the places where technology still isn't enough on its own. So for those kind of challenges, how do we deal with the situation, and what can we do to combat? Well, one of the first things that we ought to be doing is looking for warning signs. It's an unfortunate truth that in many of the attacks that we investigate, there are telltale warning signs, even if it's just a couple of hours. But in many cases we're still seeing dwell times of days or even weeks, where there are interesting statistics and information that tell us that the cyber criminals are active in the estate. In fact, in as many as 83% of the attacks that we investigate, bearing in mind there is such a high proportion of attacks that the cyber criminals will delete data, still we can still point to at least 83% of attacks where we can see that an organization has been sized up by the cyber criminals. The cyber criminals have moved laterally before actually launching an attack. And if only we'd spotted those things or the defenders had spotted those things, then maybe they could have reacted earlier and protected themselves from the ultimate outcome of that attack. In the interest of fairness, of course, this is not an easy proposition, because those bits of information in terms of logs and data, they might be quite subtle. If you think of an average organization and the wealth of data that they produce, there may only be 1 or 2 log lines of information that tell us explicitly that that organization was under some form of attack. And it could be very much like looking for the proverbial needle in the haystack, trying to find that information and then contextualize it and work out what exactly is going on. So threat hunting is not easy. And one of the things that we do to help organizations that choose to do the threat hunting for themselves is that we produce an XDR platform. So Sophos has the opportunity to use our protection, but then also our XDR platform to carry out investigations. And we've been working really hard on our XDR product, expanding it with extra capabilities to make it more of an attractive proposition to those organizations that can commit the resources to carry out their own threat hunts. So some of the things that we're up to include incorporating data from third parties. So increasing the visibility within Sophos, but using telemetry that may be derived from other technology investments, and thereby increasing the overall view of the organization, which is of course very helpful when it comes to piecing together data. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those integrations in a short while. We've also dramatically improved the case management and response actions, making it a little bit more straightforward to see which are the priorities and to carry out the most appropriate actions in a more streamlined fashion. We're presenting the detections themselves in a much more streamlined fashion, and we're simplifying the search tools that we have inside XDR. So we're removing the onus on understanding SQL and being able to structure SQL inquiries, and actually using natural language inquiries as well. So again, trying to make it as easy as it possibly can be. So here's our new detection experience. You'll see here that the detections themselves are ranked, and there's some examples there of medium, high, and critical severity. You can see the category of the attack, and you can see the source of that telemetry as well. And obviously by clicking through, you can start your threat investigation. The case management has also improved as well. So you can see there is a malware analysis report, which again is written in relatively plain English. So it's easy for people who are not maybe dedicated threat hunters to be able to understand exactly what is going on there. You can add notes to these and open a case book and pull telemetry from various different sources when you need to collect those things together. And on the subject of collating telemetry from other places, now we have the open ecosystem capability so that we can pull telemetry from a wide range of other sources. Some of these integrations are provided free of charge. Some of those integrations are chargeable, but if you've got a mixed estate of various different cybersecurity products, and if you've got potentially some other products doing other technology functions that have useful data in them, you can bring those into Sophos XDR as well, so that you've got a really good view of what's going on inside your estate, and you can leverage those tools to the maximum to be able to carry out those threat hunts for yourself. And the industry has recognized this, so you'll see that we are now ranked towards the top right there of the latest G2 report for XDR platforms. So this is based on customer usage and customer satisfaction, and you'll see that obviously our XDR users are very pleased with the advances that we've made on that platform. And one of the things I did want to talk about with XDR is now the ability to also introduce telemetry from our own NDR sensors. So just to give you a bit of clarity on what NDR is, in case it's just another acronym in this ever-increasing world of cybersecurity acronyms. NDR is network detection and response, and essentially the purpose of NDR is to monitor network traffic for suspicious flows, particularly those suspicious flows that are related to unmanaged devices. So remember, we talked earlier on about the fact that cyber criminals love an unprotected and unmanaged device because it gives them a bridgehead into the network. NDR is one of those ways that we can detect malicious activity even if we don't have presence on the endpoint itself to be able to work out what's going on. So the architecture behind this is that the NDR sensor is delivered as a virtual machine, and you send network traffic to it using a span or a mirror port from your nearest available switch. And thereby getting the telemetry of what's going on the estate and flagging up where there are devices that may be unprotected, either because you've missed them or they're unprotected because they simply cannot have a Sophos endpoint installed on them. For example, medical equipment, or I already used the example of a controller in a factory, for example. These are things that simply cannot have endpoint protection on them, but nevertheless could be used by the cyber criminal. So it's increasing the visibility and increasing the telemetry that goes into our XDR estate. However, XDR does come with a certain set of responsibilities. Obviously, technology on its own isn't enough. We talked about that. But buying a set of search tools does not necessarily equip you as an organization to be effective threat hunters. In the same way that me going out and getting a set of boxing gloves does not equip me to be a fighter. So if you're going to go down the route of XDR, it is a considered purchase, because not only do you need the tool set, but you also need those threat hunters to be able to look at the telemetry that it's generating and take meaningful responses. And it's really important as well to emphasize that we already looked at the fact that many of these attacks land during the dark hours when maybe traditional IT desks would not be functional. You need to commit to really having eyes on glass, looking at the XDR estate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that may be a realistic prospect for some of you on this call, but for others, the prospect of running a desk of that nature around the clock is simply out of reach. And we hear you. We actually believe quite fundamentally that for the vast majority of organizations, cybersecurity has now become too much of a challenge for them to be able to deal with effectively in isolation. It's no longer about creating products, throwing them over the fence and hoping that our users can utilize them effectively to keep safe. We believe now that cybersecurity is much more of a collaborative approach for many of these organizations. And this is why we advocate, as the alternative to XDR, the other way of responding to human-led attacks is to consider our managed detection and response service. So this is where we provide not only technology solutions, but then also a security desk staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year by specialists that are there, and their sole purpose is to detect and potentially to respond to incidents and cyber attacks that technology on its own simply would not be able to prevent. So all of these kind of surreptitious attacks that we've talked about, the kind of things that fly under the radar, that is what our managed detection and response desk is there to do. So augmenting the protection that you've got and then layering a bunch of human experts around there to be able to give you the optimum level of protection. So let's explore a little bit about what our MDR team actually do. Well, the first thing is that they will collate telemetry from a wide range of sources. So if you do happen to be a Sophos customer for your endpoint or your firewall or whatever it might be, then those integrations are already built and we will already accept the telemetry from those products. But the reality is that you might have a firewall from a different vendor. You might have a mixed estate with endpoints from other vendors. You might not even be a Sophos customer right now. You may have products that are outside of the realm of Sophos. And for many of these products, we actually have integrations inbuilt so that we can accept the telemetry not just from Sophos product, but also the estate that you've got. If I was to summarize that, essentially, if you've got a bunch of tools that you like, Sophos in many cases will work alongside those tools as well. So when you're going to seek budget potentially for a service of this nature, the key emphasis here is that we're not interested in necessarily doing a rip and replace. We are able to work alongside the existing security investments that you've made, and in many cases actually help you to unlock the very best return on investment from those products. Because, for example, if you bought a firewall from another vendor, if you're not looking at the alerts and the logs, you're probably not getting the best out of that product. So this is a way of unlocking the maximum capabilities of those products. So what happens to all of that data? Well, it doesn't really matter. On the left-hand side here, there's your sensors. It doesn't really matter whether those are Sophos derived products or whether they're third-party products. All of that data goes through a distinct process with a view to get this information in front of a human analyst as rapidly as we possibly can. And it sounds quite trivial, doesn't it? The idea of taking telemetry from a wide range of other sources sounds pretty straightforward, but I thought I would highlight, just to show you some of the value of the service, some of the challenges that we face. And the first is really when we start to standardize our log data. So if you've never seen a firewall log before, then today is your lucky day. So these are 3 different firewall vendors, and this is exactly the same IPS alert for all 3 vendors. And you'll see here, first of all, that the only standard in cybersecurity is that there are no standards. So one of them, just looking at one attribute, and how much of a serious attack is this? Vendor A will tell you this is threat level 4. Vendor B tells you this is severity level high, and then also gives it a score of 50. And then vendor C tells you this is attack level 9. Now, I don't know whether 9 is that good because 10 is the lowest severity of alert, or is 9 really bad because 10 is top of the scale, and how does that map to high, medium, and low? So that's just one attribute, and it shows you the lack of standard. So the first thing that we do inside our MDR matrix, if you will, is we normalize the output, so everything gets standardized into the same format. So when an analyst looks at it, they know exactly what we're talking about for every attribute associated with the attack. The next bit of magic comes down to correlation, because we already looked at the fact that many of these attacks have multi-stages behind them. So wouldn't it be great if we could pin together all the bits of telemetry and work out what an attack is and look at the attack from front to back in its entirety? And that's exactly what the correlation phase is all about. So first of all, don't worry about the GUI here. This is actually very much behind the scenes of what our MDR platform looks like. As a customer, you would never see this, but I wanted to show you this because I think it really highlights the value of correlation. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a phishing attack actually orientated towards an organization that has about 150 users. On the left hand side here, there's a bunch of endpoints that are telling us that they are seeing phishing attacks. These are actually Windows endpoints. And then on the opposite side, you've got the email protection product, which I think was Proofpoint from memory, but it certainly wasn't Sophos. So again, you've got a bunch of alerts generated from there. So this organization has 150 seats, and even in that small environment with one single attack, they've generated between them 234 alerts. Now that's a lot, even for one of our analysts to go through. So actually the correlation phase is where we take all of this disparate data and we distill it down into a single alert. So by the time our analysts got hold of this notification, they were told this is one problem. It is a spear phishing attack with a link. If you're a fan of the MITRE framework, this is technique T1192. So spear phishing attack utilizing a link. And the analysts were actually told very explicitly, this is the source of the attack. These are the recipients of this attack. This is the URL that it's asking those victims or potential victims to click on, and it gives them all the information they need to carry out an attack, an investigation to understand what the attack looks like. Now, how long does it take to get all of that information in front of an analyst? Well, this is the race to the start of resolution, and believe it or not, it takes all of 1 minute to take interesting information and feed it into a case and place it in front of one analyst. So the detection phase takes all of 1 minute. So it's taken me longer to explain than it actually takes to happen in reality. The next 25 minutes on average typically is spent by our analyst investigating this, so applying that human logic, that contextualization to work out, well, is this a real attack? If it is a real attack, how big is it? What do we do next? What is our tactic? And then there's a bit of a fork in the road here, so we'll talk about response modes in more detail in a second, but most of our customers would actually like us not only to investigate the problem, but then also to remediate that problem as well. So if we do carry out the remediation, it takes a further 12 minutes on average to roll out the scripts, kick out the bad guys, shut down malicious processes, shore up, and then notify the customer that they've had an incident and what we did to solve that problem. So if you add all those things together, that is a mean time to respond to an incident of just 38 minutes, which is really ultimately that is the value of MDR. is that ability to respond in such a short space of time. I appreciate that is a number that may not necessarily have any context for you. So just to give you a bit of an idea, right, the closest information I could find, I found a report from Gartner that was looking at the ability of internal security operations centers to respond to incidents. And obviously, first of all, bearing in mind, if you've got a SOC of your own, you probably are a pretty big organization and probably quite cyber mature. Nevertheless, the median time to respond in that survey was 16 hours. 16 hours is an eternity, and it's an eternity in which nothing positive is going to happen. The cyber criminals will inevitably be stealing data, encrypting data, leaving back doors to come back to later, and nothing positive is going to happen in that time. 16 hours with the cyber criminal rolling around your estate is not ideal. So the mean time to respond of 38 minutes, really, hopefully that really illustrates the value of shutting down that window of opportunity, minimizing the cyber criminal's capabilities to do anything malicious inside the estate. So that gives you a bit of an idea about what our service is. Again, you'll see that we are top right rated, again in the G2 for customer satisfaction for our MDR service. So we're really, really pleased that many of our customers who have already adopted this service are over the moon and delighted with the service that we provide. It's worth mentioning as well, one of the things I think that people often overlook with this kind of concept of cybersecurity as a service is that there is a whole bunch of ways that we can help deliver superior cybersecurity outcomes. And I want to just dwell on this for a moment, actually, because we never waste any information as part of our MDR desk. So I've talked about the fact that we want to get a hold of that data so that we can carry out analysis such as the active adversary report, but we also want to use that data as well to make our customers better protected. One of the great things about Sophos is that we're actually the world's largest provider of cybersecurity as a service in this kind of MDR world. And I tell you that not to be arrogant about it, but it means that we have the widest range of telemetry. So every time one of our operatives investigates an incident, obviously they will use the indicators of compromise, the TTPs, all the knowledge they can get from that attack to resolve the problem at hand. But they will also then pass that information on to Sophos Labs so that our labs team can actually create new policies, new rules, new detections that mean our product ultimately gets better. And that flywheel can be very rapid at times. So it takes around about 60 minutes on average to go through this sort of process. So once we've closed an investigation to actually protecting customers from this attack, so it's never an issue again. And what that means to you as a customer is if an organization gets attacked on the opposite side of the world, potentially within as little as 60 minutes, you are being protected from that attack. It's like buying into a cybersecurity club where everybody benefits from one organization's slightly unfortunate experiences. So it's a hugely beneficial cycle. And bear in mind, this also incorporates that third-party telemetry as well. So we're actually able to learn and glean a lot of information that with the source data may not always necessarily be Sophos native products. So hopefully you've seen that we offer a lot of value with both our XDR and our MDR services, and in particular with the MDR side of things, you may have a couple of objections in your mind already. And one of those first is potentially, well, what about my existing people? Well, bearing in mind that we are offering dedicated threat hunting resources, most organizations probably don't have people doing that. And I want to emphasize that being a really good IT manager does not make you a threat hunter and vice versa. So most of you on this call probably are not going to have anybody that operates in this sphere already. But if you do happen to operate a security team, then first and foremost, good for you and well done for being so cyber mature. But I just wonder maybe what that security team's outputs might be, because many cases what we see is that cyber teams are inundated with huge volumes of data and telemetry coming from multiple different sources, and they spend more time doing this. I like to call this alert whack-a-mole. They spend more time dismissing alerts and dealing with logs and information rather than actually carrying out cybersecurity tasks. And we could take this SOC analyst and we can make them super sharp. Because remember I said there was a fork in the road. Once we've found interesting data inside your telemetry and once we've investigated, we could hand you the case notes. So instead of you having to look through, let's say you found all 234 alerts in that phishing attack, rather than you having to investigate that in-house, we can simply tell you, you are under attack, this is the nature of the attack, this is what you need to do to go and fix the problem. So we can make your SOC team super sharp and super effective if that's what you want. And of course, it can be a collaboration as well. You know, many organizations, maybe they have some cyber skills available during the working hours, but then of course, evenings, weekends, bank holidays. And we've already seen, based on the active adversary report, but that's actually the time that you really need the help, because that's when the cyber criminals will launch their attacks. So if you don't have the capabilities in-house to run that 24/7 team, then this is where it can be a collaboration. You can tell us that during these hours, call the office and we'll fix the problems ourselves. Out of hours, please fix the problems for us and let us know what you've done. So it can be very much a collaborative operation. And of course, you know, working with your existing people, working with your ability to respond, but then also, again, I'm just going to re-emphasize, working with your existing technology stack as well. So really meeting you where you are in terms of your cybersecurity requirements. So I've talked about a lot. I'm conscious that we are getting up towards the hour, so I thought now would probably be a good time to bring the session to a close. So I'm just going to go through a couple of conclusions, but just before I do that, do bear in mind there is a question dialog box over on the right hand side there. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask, then feel free to fire them in there. Get typing now, and I'll come to those in just a second. But yeah, just by way of wrap up, essentially the world of cybercrime and cybersecurity, of course, is constantly evolving, and the biggest evolution to date has now been the use of active adversaries, so human-led attacks that ultimately require some kind of advanced threat hunting, because we've already highlighted that technology on its own isn't enough. So for those organizations that have human expertise or want to invest in human expertise and would be able to commit to 24/7 operation, we provide an XDR platform that takes telemetry not just from Sophos products, but also a wide range of other security vendors as well. But for those organizations that potentially don't have that capability, we then also offer the MDR service. So this is where we provide threat hunting services on your behalf to organizations that are not able to use those capabilities themselves, and collaborate with them to offer the very best cybersecurity outcomes by putting those human experts in front of the problem. And we've already highlighted that, of course, the only real way to deal with these human-led attacks is to have human expertise able to respond. So those are the key takeaways from this session. The other key takeaways, of course, is the active adversary report and the state of ransomware report, both freely available on the Sophos website. You are very much encouraged to download those resources and take a look. They are really genuinely interesting reads. So with all of that said, thank you very much indeed for your time and attention. I'm now going to take a look at some of the questions that we've got here. And okay, somebody's really keen. So the first question is, how do we go about getting a quote for MDR? So I will tell you a little bit about the way the product is priced and licensed, but I can't give you actual numbers because that's not my job, frankly speaking. The way that we license MDR is very much the same way that we license our other endpoint solutions. So what is the size of your organization? How many servers do you have? We also charge for the integration packs that I mentioned. So I'm just going to roll the slides back a little and just show you those integration packs again. So the endpoint pack is actually a free of charge integration. The other ones that are on here, then if you want to take telemetry from a third-party firewall, if you want to take telemetry from a third-party identity provider, etc., then you're buying those packs as well. But again, a Sophos territory account manager, or if you're in the channel, then a channel account manager will be able to give you some guidance on exactly how we price and license that in more detail. But that gives you just a little bit of a flavor about how we do things. The licensing process is pretty straightforward, and of course we would be delighted to help you with a quotation. And if you need it, things like looking at the return on investment. So if you need to take it higher to seek the budget, then we can help you justify your decisions by looking at your organization, their needs, and understanding how we might be able to unlock additional resources and capabilities inside the estate. So a good way of justifying that, so we can work with you on that one. That was a great question, so thank you. Another question that we've got as well is the question of do small businesses experience the same types of attacks as enterprise organizations? And that's really interesting, actually, because ransomware used to be very much an enterprise level problem. And essentially the reason behind that is that cyber criminals are pretty much motivated on the same return on investment decisions that a legitimate business would do. So if you're going to spend a lot of effort attacking organizations, then you probably want to make sure you've got an organization that has pretty deep wallet to be able to pay and ultimately cash out on those attacks. One of the interesting things that we've observed is, again, another side effect of the cyber criminals forming gangs is that their overall cost of an attack and the barrier to entry to attacks is actually quite significantly lower. And the net result of that is that organizations that are a bit smaller, maybe not as cash rich, maybe they traditionally wouldn't have been a viable target because their ability to pay was so low. Actually, now all of a sudden they're in the firing line because the cost of launching an attack is lower. Therefore, the expectations in terms of a payout can be lower as well. So that's one of the side effects of cybercriminals coalescing into gangs. You've also got the advent. It's not a new thing, really, I suppose, but ransomware as a service, where you don't even have to be a cybersecurity or a cybercrime expert. You just need to be able to push a few buttons and buy some services in. That has also massively reduced the barrier to entry. So the shorthand answer is small businesses are very much in the firing line in the same way that larger enterprises are. The real challenge actually is, if you're a smaller organization, is that you probably don't have the resources to throw at the problem. So you may not have access to the best tech. You probably couldn't run a dedicated 24/7 service, for example. So this is precisely why MDR exists, is to help kind of cover the gap between the ability for a small organization to respond to essentially the same kind of attacks. So that's a really good question as well. Thank you very much indeed for that. Right, I've got another one that's just arrived in as well. So this one's looking at should I have all of my cybersecurity products from one vendor, or am I better off splitting those products and services out into different vendors? And that's a really good question as well. It used to be the case that sometimes you'd buy a security product from one vendor or another and they'd be slightly better at something, but actually in a lot of cases now the ability to protect is reasonably similar. But where you get distinct advantages now is where products can actually interoperate together. So one of the great things about the sort of Sophos portfolio is the ability for things like the firewall and the endpoint to work together collectively as a system actually, again, leads to better cybersecurity outcomes. So using automation capabilities that are only really possible in a single vendor ecosystem is a bit of a benefit for sure. And the ability to spend less time managing your products because it's all in one dashboard, that has a tangible overall impact on the cost of ownership of a product as well. So that's a definite measurable thing. But of course, you've seen that we operate an open ecosystem as well. So if for whatever reason you choose that maybe a different cybersecurity vendor is the right one for you, it doesn't preclude you from using our MDR services. It doesn't preclude you from using our XDR dashboard as well now. So the choice is essentially yours to do as you see fit and what fits in with the organization. And let's be honest, the investments and the skill set you've already made and invested in is obviously going to drive that decision. But we're happy to have that conversation either way to help work out what's right for you as an organization. But again, a very, very good question. And that brings me to the end of the questions, actually. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and to see if there's any more. And if not, I'll bring the session to a close and wrap up. So final call. Nope, I'll assume everybody has asked the questions that they wanted to ask. So once again, thank you very much indeed for your time and your attention during today's session. If you want to know more, of course, reach out to your local Sophos rep. Do visit the Sophos website. Do download those 2 reports I've mentioned several times over. They're great resources. Other than that, take care, enjoy the rest of your day. And once again, thank you for joining us. Bye for now.